Since humans walked the earth and had language to talk about it, they have attempted to predict the future. Ancient Greek oracles and seers practiced divination. French apothecary Michel de Notre Dame, or Nostradamus, published the Prophecies in 1555, predicting future wars and catastrophes. In 1798, English scholar Thomas Malthus claimed that the world would overpopulate, as the food supply could only increase arithmetically. And in 1993, Samuel Huntington rocked the political science world with the belief that there would be a clash of civilizations resulting from individuals' cultural and religious identities. Sir Arthur Charles Clarke, a British futurist, science fiction author, and inventor, spoke of such predictions on the BBC Horizon program in 1964.
Trying to predict the future is a discouraging and hazardous occupation. If by some miracle a prophet could describe the future exactly as it was going to take place, his predictions would sound so absurd, so far-fetched, that everybody would laugh him to scorn.
But what if we could predict parts of the global political future, and it was not quite so far-fetched? One man is trying to do something like that. By burying himself in the news coverage written decades before the recent phenomenal Arab Spring, Kalev Leetaru has found some very unique trends.
I would take all of the news coverage around the world about Egypt, so anything from any country that mentioned Egypt, and just look at the average tone, how positive overall and how negative overall that coverage was. And it turns out that that actually gives you sort of the global mood about Egypt, and it turns out that you actually see that begin plunging right ahead of the revolution.
Not only does Leetaru say he was able to predict the timing of the Egyptian revolt through his retrospective analyses of global media, but he was also able to predict the same for the Tunisian Revolution. Leetaru is the Assistant Director of Text and Digital Media and Analytics at the Institute for Computing and the Humanities, Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois, and a center affiliate of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, also at the University of Illinois. His work first caught the eyes of the BBC on September 9th and was written about in 100 other countries, yet has received little coverage in the U.S. Leetaru used an SLGI Altix supercomputer, or Nautilus, with 4 tetrabytes of memory at the University of Tennessee to analyze 100 million articles, print and broadcast, spanning 60 years. He gathered his data from local and global news sources, including vernacular-based media. For analyzing the revolutions, Leetaru looked at the tone as well as the location of all media reports, regardless of subject. Mood detection searched for words such as terrible and nice, while location detection found where the story happened and where the participants were situated, and then converted the places into coordinates on a map. He derived the idea for mood detection from another field.
There's been a huge building of work over in economics literature on tone predicts things, but no one had attempted to do this at scale for looking at the social world. So this was really sort of the first piece to say, you know what, tone actually isn't just for economics.
The idea for the analyses, he says, was based on the concept of information overload in society.
The project actually began with this notion of we have so much, data, news in particular. There's just so much historical and digital news data, especially today. What can we do with all that material? Can we find new, interesting insights to human society?
Leetaru's analyses show that aggregated global tone has strong predictive power. His supercomputer produced tone curves, as in Egypt, where he found a huge decrease in the month of January, signaling an intensifying negative global and local view of the overall situation in the country. Similarly, a tone curve for Hosni Mubarak showed global attitudes toward the leader as constantly decreasing since January 1999, and then hitting a major dip in January 2011. Leetaru says this was an indication that Mubarak had lost global legitimacy. Both of these analyses help to explain the Spring Revolution in Egypt.
By using this type of data, you're able to figure out that, this country's in a really different place now. So immediately you know that, there's a much greater risk that something big will happen this time. Basically, the situation just needs a catalyst to go. And that's really an idea behind this work.
Leetaru explained that he has not been the only one to see the value in global attitudes represented in the news. World War II, he says, was the first time when U.S. and British intelligence services started monitoring global media.
They weren't interested in factual information. As one famous quote goes, We have much better ways of figuring out which way the tanks are going than reading about it the next day in the newspaper. But what it was used for was views.
Leetaro says a brand new U.S. government agency began monitoring world news just a day before the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941.
And his very first report that it produced was a day before Pearl Harbor, and it said, over the past weeks, Japan has dropped all appeals for peace. It's refocused its attention on the U.S., and it's turned sharply negative about the U.S. And sure enough, the next day we had Pearl Harbor. And, what you're finding is that news media isn't perfect, but it gives you some really interesting views into what's happening around the world.
Leetaro did not stop at analyzing news coverage for tone, however. He conducted another test to see how closely he could predict the location of Osama bin Laden using all the media prior to his May finding and death. It turns out that his supercomputer was able to predict bin Laden's hidden location within 200 kilometers of where he was actually found in Abbottabad.
I just scooped up all the news coverage that's been said about him over the last 30 years, and really he hasn't really been in the news until the last 10 years, and just made a map of all the locations mentioned in that news coverage. So any article anywhere in the world about bin Laden, what were the cities and mountains and hills and rivers mentioned in that? And it turns out you end up with this map of the world where all roads lead to a 200-kilometer radius around the city he was actually captured.
If predicting bin Laden's hidden location was not satisfying enough, Leetaro continued working with global news to see what other kinds of insights he could gain. He conducted another analysis to see what areas of the world, or modern civilizations as Samuel Huntington called them, together, and which have the most interaction. The analysis showed that countries geographically close to one another tend to have the strongest connections, yet he also found that colonial ties remain prevalent, with Spain and Portugal more connected to Latin America, and France more connected to Africa, for example. Lastly, when Leetaro separated his analysis based on countries and their medias, he discovered interesting commentary on coverage biases.
When it was run against the New York Times, you ended up with this view of the world that really didn't make a lot of sense. The New York Times map, you see the entire world revolve around New York and Washington. The global map, you don't see that as much.
Leetaro explains that his analysis showed each country portraying the world based on its particular global interests and involvement. The United States, of course, showed the same.
It's fascinating to see how vivid it is, to see that in the New York Times, literally, no matter what's happening around the world, no matter how little it has to do with the U.S., is being portrayed to a U.S. audience in terms of U.S. context. So, as an American, what are we getting from American press?
To produce these graphs and maps requires heavy computing power and programming, but Leetaro believes his findings hold huge potential for the future.
And so to find that it worked this well was just shocking, to say, basically, there's something here. There's some, obviously it's going to need a lot more refinement, but you know what? There's promise here that this actually has potential.
When asked about the possibility of including social media in future analyses, Leetaro, though enthusiastic about such websites and communication, is not yet sure where its place is in the whole mix. He is excited to see where such new forums for information can fit in his analyses and vision. Ultimately, Leetaro's goal is to create a website that would update every 15 minutes or so with the current trends in global news. If successful in real time, the site could encourage new policies from organizations and politicians for aid, outreach, action, and diplomacy. In some cases, it could even help to prevent violence and repression. For War News Radio, I'm Elliana Bisgaard-Church.